Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another episode of Education Matters with Jim O'Connell. We're here. It's Halloween night, and so I'm glad to be joined by a guest who I'll introduce in a moment. But it's Halloween night, October 31st, and tonight in Manchester we have trick-or-treating is tonight going ahead despite the challenges of the high winds and everything that happened yesterday. And there are still some neighbourhoods, certainly in the North End, I know there are some neighbourhoods that are still without power or were without power a couple of hours ago, and Hooksett, parts of Hooksett were without power. But anyway, trick-and-treating goes ahead tonight, 6 to 8 p.m. The city, DPW, police, etc. have done a great job of getting everything into a safe condition. But, be careful out there, have some fun. Hopefully everybody's safe and etc. We'll get back to we're here. This show is being recorded and it's live right now. If you want to call in, the call-in number is 640-3091. We talk about education, but we can talk about things more broadly about what's happening in Manchester and even beyond. Again, 640-3091. This show is repeated 8 times during the week as we go on. So our next show will be on election night, November 7th. And so my biggest admonishment to everybody would be go out and vote. It does matter and it does make a difference. So with that, I have my friend Ross Terrio, who's a candidate for school board in Ward 7, who's joined me here tonight. Welcome, Ross.
Thanks, Jim, for having me. So again, Ross Terrio, school board Ward 7, running for election. I appreciate your vote. But I wanted to touch on something because it's such an important issue that we talked about in the radio show that previously, is tax policy. Again, the Manchester tax policy, when we look at the, it's kind of I'm a kind of a government wonk, so most people don't like this stuff. But if you look at the Manchester tax policy, and we go onto the New Hampshire Department of Revenue's website, we see that we're paying higher than average for our city services.
Right.
But then we're also paying lower than average for our school side. And so we could probably solve the school budget funding in large part by just balancing by just averaging and matching the tax rates or the percentage spent on taxes for the other municipalities and towns. And I know you've looked a lot at this.
And if you look at it, it's very easy to see it in like a pie chart representation, which you can pull right off those spreadsheets from the DAR. So you can see the way the pie is divided. The division is off when it comes to Manchester. But then the other thing, when you look at tax policy, and I'm not a tax wonk, but when you look at tax policy, we are generally, as a city, and this has to do with New Hampshire state policy as well as city policy, because we don't have a sales tax, because we don't have an income tax, and because we rely solely or quite heavily on property taxes. The tax burden for people in the city of Manchester is very low compared to most other cities. Yes. So when we look at, I think it was last week, and I meant to pull this up, and I didn't as usual, but I think Manchester is the 15th, it's the 15th wealthiest municipality in the United States, which amazed me, really. It turns out that New York was actually less because New York included all 5 boroughs, and so when you included all the 5 boroughs, it changed it. But being 15th is still, we were up there with some of the major California centres and all the rest of it. And so there is a misperception. That doesn't mean that we don't have issues around poverty and homelessness and all the challenges that every city has. But just to go to the point, we as citizens of the United States, people in Manchester, of their total value and income, however you want to measure it, their tax burden is lower than the majority of people in the United States is. So now, as a function of what goes on in the state, that I believe our tax burden is pretty average, and I don't remember the details, but it's not like Manchester is a high tax I mean, we know we're low for schools, but over both sides, city and schools, my last recollection was average. I don't remember what average meant, but it didn't peak on one side or the other. Because I think, Ross, people sometimes, for years I talked about the school system, and when we were 15th from the bottom and 10th from the bottom, I always was in these nuanced conversations about, now you had to have lots of what I thought was almost a waste of time arguing about how we've gone from 11 to 10.5, and everybody's like, so as soon as we got to the absolutes, that's why I keep sticking with the absolutes, because it's and if I was to be very truthful, when it comes to school board, I misspoke when I was speaking on a radio show Ross and I were on earlier on, because I always say it and I know it's untrue. Believe that or not, there's a quote for you, that we're the lowest in the state. There's actually one town this year, which is the town of Milan, which is, I don't even know where, in my ignorance, I don't know where Milan is, but it's a very small.
It's in Italy.
The other Milan.
No, actually, what's surprising though, just because I was just looking at the numbers the other day, what we spend per pupil is very close to what Bedford spends per pupil. And it's kind of amazing because they have such great outcomes.
Right.
And they're kind of an outlier as far as spending, because the average city or town in New Hampshire spends a lot of money.
A lot more.
Some towns spend $20,000 per
Some
pupil.
Up to 30 is the highest. 30, yeah.
And we obviously we're in the bottom.
Yes.
But Bedford is
right.
They have great outcomes. They have one of the best school systems in the state, and yet they also have they're very low per pupil. But I'm going to leave soon. But I just wanted to get one other thing, and you can.
And there's a reason for that, and I'll visit that.
You can
afterwards,
pontificate on these things.
I hate this pontificating thing. That implies
ruminate.
Ruminate is good.
I'm really hoping in November we get the chance to vote on Keno. And I'm kind of a gambler, so I don't mind. I actually support gambling, casino gambling, but I hope that the people of Manchester approve Keno, because that'll be they've estimates of up to $1.8 million in additional funding for our schools. So I'm really hoping that the people of Manchester approve Keno, and I'd really love to do that little bit of extra funding. Would go a long way in the Manchester
So
schools.
if the Manchester people were to reject the Keno,
still get the money. But we're the biggest. Obviously we're the biggest city. It doesn't make sense. If let's say Milan or Dublin, get another one in Ireland, the one in New Hampshire,
the real one. Yeah.
Let's say they can approve Keno all they want, but I just don't see people flocking to small communities for it to be a moneymaker for the state. I really believe you need large communities like Nashua, Salem,
and Portsmouth has already rejected it, I believe.
Manchester, you need the large communities that can support Keno palaces, whatever they are. For the people to come in, for the money to start coming in.
Yeah, and I don't have a strong opinion on it one way or the other. I mean, I do have an opinion about the whole idea of funding government by such methods, but I'm not going to allow that to sort of interfere with the practical, pragmatic thing. This is what we're stuck with, so this is what we're stuck with. So
I'm going to leave in 1 minute, but I want to add on to that, and I want you, after I leave, I can watch a show, but. What do you think about Colorado? Because you'll see my answers in the Union Leader, but I proposed, and I know it's a lesser of two evils, or not a great thing, but legalizing marijuana, taxing it, and using the money from that to fund education and other needed things.
Yeah. So generally speaking, I don't agree with the war on drugs, because the war on drugs has been just a boondoggle. It's been a loss, and the idea that police chiefs in a one police officer town somewhere up in the Maine border are purchasing like bear cats or something under the war on drugs seems like a ludicrous thing to me. And I just made that piece up, but that sort of thing going on. We see the same thing happening with DHS, Department of Homeland Security spending. Anti-terrorism spending is a joke for some the police departments. But anyway, so that doesn't work. The biggest, the only issue, the thing that gives me hesitancy is just because of the opiate crisis, right? The timing of it. I think because I think it's a big change. I mean, what's happened in Colorado, we're still taking baby steps. I know, but. So to me, if so long as it's illegal fully, then you're putting it into the black market, and so it causes crime, it adds to crime, etc. And so the problem is how it's managed, and the idea of people and other states are challenged with this right now, how to manage DUI charges and stuff, people operating under the influence. What about people working under the influence, etc., etc. The technology's catching up now because better testing is being invented as we speak. No, generally the notion seems sound to me. But in the end, Ross, I do agree with that. But in the end, to me, it's very simple. The most equitable and fair thing to do is to have a universal tax in the state of New Hampshire, and whether that's like someone like our friend Mr. Forbes years ago when ran for president talked about a flat tax, he was talking about 17% at the time or something. I prefer a progressive tax, an income tax based on ability to pay and all that stuff.
So
I am, of course. Sense. Well, and I'm rational and I'm fact based and science based, so I don't reject all those things like my Republican friends do, who reject science and reality.
I consider myself a scientist, so
well, that's good. So there are minorities in every party, Ross. But it's nice to joke around.
Well, I'm going to go, but
that would be the better way. Thank you.
But my friends who and I have supported this petition, people who do want to legalize marijuana. So one of the assertions that have made, and I don't know the truth of the matter, but is that there, in places where legal marijuana is more readily accessible or legalized, is less heroin use, and maybe that's
right.
I have A instead of B.
Well, I lived in Amsterdam 35 years ago, and it's actually maybe a little bit right around 35 years ago. I lived in Amsterdam. I spent almost a year there, and marijuana was legal in Amsterdam back then, and it was regulated and managed, and there were pieces of, we could talk about, this is too long for your 1 minute you got left, but it was a better solution than the alternative. But then they did lots of things there that were very progressive, and I didn't like all of them. But the idea of doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, to no avail, makes no sense. But fundamentally, in the state of New Hampshire, we have such hubris that we think we can do better than the other, than 48 of the other 50 states can do, based on just our insistence that we won't fund things. Because in the end, we just don't fund them. That's so we do less with less. And people like to think we do more with less. We do less with less, and that's the cut and thrust of politics, to decide where that line should be.
But I got to go.
That's where we get to talk.
School Board Ward 7. I'd appreciate your vote. Jim, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Ross. I look forward to you. You're always welcome, as you know.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot. And like I said, folks, as Ross departs the scene, the biggest thing is whatever your beliefs are and whatever solutions you might think, please be engaged and go out and vote on November 7th, because it actually does make a difference, because it will decide who gets to decide the future of the city. And Ross has been on this show a number of times, and he and I are we have some commonalities between us. We have some Irish connections, etc., and some other things. But his viewpoint is very different to mine in the solutions that he might choose. But I enjoy being able to talk to people who are rational and they're able to explain their point of view, and sometimes and oftentimes we'll agree to differ, and that's fine. I wanted to go, so because the night that's in it. 1 week before the election, this is everybody's busy on the election season and out and about, and so that's what people are tied up with. But I wanted to just talk about something around the schools for a minute. First thing, just on the sports side, the Central boys soccer team won got through the state semi-final this weekend in a really close game against their perennial adversary, Bedford, and a wonderful game was held out there, and it was great to see a large contingent of Manchester people in that away game at Bedford High School, which is a nice facility, nice grounds right next to the school, and there was kudos to the young people who attend Central High School. They were there in large numbers, cheering on their team. And the fact that Team 1 was really nice, too, and congratulations to Chris LeBurge and his staff and everybody for the achievement. They go on to play in the state semi-final, where they will meet. I think they're going to meet, let me think, I think it's Pinkerton, sorry. They will meet Pinkerton on Wednesday afternoon at Stellos Stadium in Nashua. And anybody, if you want to go and see some good soccer and cheer on the city of Manchester, albeit through Central High School, and you're in the Nashua area on Wednesday afternoon at 6, then that would be a fun thing to do. And if you can't make Wednesday for that semi-final, well, guess what? The Central High School girls, with Coach Peter Lally, went and won their quarterfinal in a wonderful game against. They beat Pinkerton on Sunday. And beat them 2-0, I believe, in another exciting game. And again, at Gill Stadium, it was great to see. The stadium had a good crowd in it. I don't know how many people were there, but the parking lot was full. We had to park and away from the stadium itself. But such a great bunch of girls. I've been involved with soccer for a long time, and other sports too, but in this case we're talking about soccer, and just there's some really talented young ladies playing on that team, and are due for great things. And they will be playing in the state semi-final on Thursday, and if all things are equal, then they'll be playing this weekend in state finals. And we also have city teams in the state cross country finals for this year. So it's been an exciting week or two in sports in Manchester. We see Manchester schools being represented at the highest level in the state, and given the challenges that our programs have. And doing the comparison with some other places, there's great credit due to everybody involved, from parents to kids to coaches and to everybody else. We have a school district that funds its sports programs less well than many other districts do. We only have a half-time athletic director in the district, which is just another. We talk on this program all the time about the shortages, etc., and it just makes no sense. I was watching a piece on Channel 12 WMUR last night, and there was a piece on about concussion in sports, and the full-time concussion advisor at Pinkerton Academy was being interviewed. And I'm thinking to myself, you go to Manchester and you have an athletic director for the city who is an older gentleman who works part-time. And he has 15,000 or 14,500 students to oversee, and all their programs across multiple facilities. And you go into Central High School and you have an athletic director who also is the full-time coach, who's also the school counselor, who's wearing many hats, who has the responsibility of making sure that all those diverse teams at Central High School, that they have the everything in place, from transportation to facilities to the logistics of people leaving earlier, coming later, whatever it might be, all the things that go into any particular program, from football to skiing to golf to soccer. And it's only then when you look, for those people who don't want to, and I said this last week about paying attention down in the weeds, about, if I could see the spreadsheets. This is my argument about, if you don't want to go and look at the spreadsheets to see where the money is in Manchester and how it stacks up against other towns, and if you do, if you can just believe those politicians who are saying to you, we don't need additional resources, it's a matter of how the money's allocated. And at least my friend Ross here, who is a conservative Republican candidate for office, at least he has the honesty to recall the numbers and say, yes, we've got the least well-funded school system in the state. So at least we don't have to have that conversation. And we could talk about the best way to use the resources we have, what other things we might do. We can have all those conversations, but at least we're not lying to each other. I don't have to sit here and try to talk to somebody who denies the facts that are right in front of them. So this idea about, if you don't want to, if you're busy and you have a real life and you've got, a family and a husband or kids or whatever to look after, and and you don't want to take the time to go into this. You don't need it. The evidence. There's some low hanging fruit that I talked about last week. About the fact that we've got one truant officer for 14,500 kids. The fact that we've got two SAP officers for 3,600 kids in middle school. We can go on and look at this stuff. The fact that one of our middle schools in the library, they've had new books once in the last 16 years. There's lots of places. And then when you look at sports and you go to this issue of a part-time director of sports, etc., it's actually quite sad and pathetic. And it's up to you, the voters. You get to choose in 7 days' time. As this show goes on for the rest of this week, it'll get closer and closer down to 1 day's time, because the next time, God willing, that I'm sitting here talking on this program, it'll be the night of the election, Tuesday, November the 7th, and as I come off the air at 7 p.m., the election will be finishing. So most people who'll be watching this show over the next week it'll be a wind down to that. But your vote really matters as to what we do, and people just standing there saying, not another dime, and what we're doing is fine. They're just lying to you. And that's a strong word, but we're here on the eve of the elections, and I want to use, categorical language. It's very plain that we're not doing what we should be doing. I mean, soccer is not where the world begins and ends. I'm an academic guy first. I'd much prefer to see money and put into academic programs and helping children to succeed, especially those kids who most need our help. But just take soccer as an example, because it's easy to think about and say, well, so take this example. The middle school soccer was eliminated after fighting for years to get it put in there in the Tri-County, and we were successful in getting it there a couple of years ago, literally 2 years ago, and now it's abandoned again. And so I think there's great credit due to, in this case, at Central High School, Mr. Chris LeBurge and Mr. Peter Lally, the boys and girls coaches, respectively, but also to everybody else. Mr. Silvero and Flo and the guys at Memorial and the people at West, and everybody who are out there competing at statewide competitions at high school with no feeder program. And you go up to Concord. Concord Middle School has got 3 boys' middle school soccer teams. They travel with one and they do intramural with the other 2. So the Concord kids, who are always, they're in this. It's very likely that Central might meet Concord. They're one of the semi-finalists, so we won't meet them in the semi-final, but they could possibly be a finalist. But as an example, Concord, young people in Concord have got 3 years of soccer training under a coach in the public school system before they hit high school. They've got 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, funded properly, and with coaches, etc. And those kids, and then the coaches at Central inherit these kids in freshman year, some of whom who've never been on an organised team. If it wasn't for the rec leagues like Manchester North Soccer League or Manchester South, East, and West, if it wasn't, or the Angels program, if it wasn't for them, then these kids would all be raw walking in the doors. But once again, we're relying on charity and outside sources and non-profits like the organisation I'm associated with, Manchester North Soccer, and others, to fulfill what should be a program run by the city. Because that's what every other city does. And you only have to go on, I think it's, what is it? You'd have to Google Tri-County Sports, New Hampshire. And if you look there, you'll be able to see the list of middle school. That's a middle school sports program. If you look there, and you'll see the list of all the schools in the state that have that send their middle schoolers and play in these games, and they travel to them and they play each other home and away and all that stuff. And it's right down. They're all right there. Litchfield and Merrimack and Hooksett and Concord and Bedford and right there. And then where the space should be for Southside, McLaughlin, Hillside, and Parkside, those spaces that should be on that list and that were there 2 years ago, they're blank. They're not there because the city of Manchester just doesn't fund it. Kids don't need it. Kids are resilient, Mayor Gatsas will tell you. They can go out in the neighborhood and they'll find friends to hang out with in the neighborhood and they'll be fine. Well, that's Manchester's answer, and we can see, right, there are people with kids giving at Manchester its answer constantly, and we have a declining student population as a result of it. And anybody who's got their pulling the wool over their eyes who thinks that a declining child population is a healthy thing for a city, there's nothing healthy about it. A vibrant, exciting, growing place, a destination where people want to come to, would not be suffering from declining numbers in its schools and in its families. So yeah, are there good things happening in Manchester? Yeah, there are some good things happening in Manchester. But our schools badly need to be turned around. And when we've got somebody like Ross Terrio, a Republican candidate and a Conservative, running in this city, who's willing to recognise and recognises it here, that our funding for our schools is way out of whack. And this is why, I have no problem with endorsing Joyce Craig for candidate for mayor. And the reason is because I know what Mayor Gatsis is going to give me, because he's going to give me what he's given me for the last 8 years. And the 12 years before that at the State House and as an alderman. He just doesn't value the whole thing, obviously, doesn't believe in taking any corrective action, and he can't, and he doesn't want to, because he just wants to insist that everything's fine, and everything's not fine. So, frankly, not to be callous, I think anybody who has been in public office for a long time and given of their time and energy and talents to our city at the level that he has deserves our gratitude as he departs. But he starts his speeches nowadays and talks about I'm a lifelong I'm a lifelong resident of Manchester. I grew up on a pig farm in the south end of Manchester. That's his opening line for his speeches, and as I've been listening to him, I'm thinking, given the way in which you've behaved and your inability to play nicely with others in the sandbox, your sort of bullying and dictatorial manner in the chamber, the fact that when you were up in Concord and you couldn't play nicely even with people and your fellow Republicans up there, you couldn't make friends there. You've done a lousy job, in my interpretation, of making friends for the city of Manchester across the region. Then I think it's time we put you back on the farm. So I would suggest that voters do the right thing on November 7th and say thank you to Ted Gatsis for his time and put him out to pasture. And that's what you do with on a farm when you have an animal that served you well for a long. I don't mean to be please. I don't mean to be rude about that and comparing anybody. Certainly, that sounds like I was being. I'm just saying. So then, what you do with somebody when they've come to the end of their useful time, you put them back on the farm. So I think the time to send Ted back to the farm is high and nigh, and it ought to be done. I'm sure he's given of his best, or this is the best that he can do, and his best isn't good enough. The city needs to move on. It needs to do other things. I don't understand, for instance. I know that Mayor Gatsis is not a collaborative person. He doesn't claim to be. It's a my way or the highway attitude with him, and so he doesn't play nicely with others. And therefore, the mayors of Portsmouth and Concord and Nashua and Keene and other towns in our state, there is no camaraderie. There is no common voice across them because that's Mayor Gatsis isn't going to. He doesn't lend himself to that. And I think in the state of New Hampshire, just in the state of New Hampshire, the voices of the city of Manchester and of Nashua and of Concord, we're not all going to agree and have the same desires and the same needs all the time. But there's a lot more in common between those cities than there is that separates them, and there's no reason why the city of Manchester, backed up by the other large municipalities in the state, couldn't get its wish and have its way in Concord against with the 400 representatives in the in state government. But because Mayor Gatsis told me to my face when I asked him about collaborating with others and working with other municipalities and with the congressional delegation and etc. He told me blank. He gave me a blank no, and his answer was good luck with that. And I wanted to, at some point to bring the state representatives, not just of the city of Manchester, but of the surrounding towns. Let's make no mistake about it. If you're a public representative and you represent Hooksett, I can tell you something. You should be mightily concerned about what's happening in Manchester, and you should be doing what is ever is best for Manchester, as well as what's best for Hooksett, because I think they go hand in hand. I think if Manchester were to deteriorate and become some kind of crime-ridden, lawless place, then it will affect the property values of every house in Hooksett. There is no barbed wire fence at the top of Hanover, at the top of Hooksett Hill, nor is there one into Londonderry, and so some city councillor or some town representative from some small town around the area could try to lead such an effort, but it naturally falls to a leader of a city like the city of Manchester. And I would encourage Mayor Craig, Joyce Craig, as an incoming mayor in Manchester, to embrace that role. Spread the wealth. It's not fair that the city of Manchester should have to carry the burden for what is really a region-wide issue, between mutual help and all the other things that the city of Manchester finds itself supplying or having in place. Then that's part of the reason, I think, where we see this upside down funding level compared to all the other towns in the state, where we spend less on schools than everybody else and we spend more on municipal services than everybody else. Well, it's time that shoulders were put to the wheel, but that will take vision and a new level of excitement and initiative. Somebody who's ready to do the right thing by the city of Manchester, and we're seeing that in this election. We're seeing clearly, I think, this need for people with a brighter vision of the city to lead us to where we need to go. And there are too many people, who are sort of fat and happy, who've been around a long time. They've had their shot. They may have had something to contribute in the past, and it was exciting and shiny and new. Now it's old and tarnished and ill-kept, and it's time to just move on. I think every candidate's too late now because they're already on and running it. I think they should be asking themselves, what's the compelling reason why you're running for office? What is it that makes you the best representative of your ward? Why are you better than others? And I think when it comes to experience, there's something to be said for that. I think there are some experienced candidates running for office who can lean heavily on that and say, I've learned a lot, and so my reason for running is because I can be more effective, because I'll hit the ground running. I know what I'm talking about. I know where the secret sauce is, and I'll be faster to get it done for you than others would. And then there are those who are running for office who will say, and they'll be right, when they run against somebody whose ideas are, not new and have little of real value to offer other than to keep the seat warm for another 2 years. And I would reject them out of hand and say, the city of Manchester, time is of the essence, right? Time's the only scarce resource in the end. Everything else is possible to get more of, to duplicate. But time is not. Time is of the essence. We need to be doing stuff today. We should have been doing stuff for the last 8 years. There's the only reason why the towns of Candia and Auburn and Hooksett are no longer sending their wonderful young children to the city of Manchester to be educated in our great schools is because Mayor Gatsas dropped the ball, oversaw the downsizing of our city schools, the ill funding of the schools, allowed them to fall into a state where the classes were overcrowded and they didn't have the technology needed for teaching in today's world, and people rejected it hand out a fist. And being the kind of man he is, he wasn't able to turn the juggernaut around. And so he proceeded with a course that was catastrophic for the city of Manchester, and we're going to live with that catastrophe for many years to come. that our relationships with the towns that are basically little Manchesters around us, that those relationships were cut off. And make no mistake about it, that all rests on the shoulders of one man. I'm not saying he didn't have enablers. I'm not saying that it didn't take, more. It took more than just him on his own. But clearly, he led this effort. He sat at that podium and made it clear it was his way or the highway. His attitude to the surrounding towns was take it or leave it, and they left it. And the empirical evidence says they were right. And he's still standing on that smoking hulk of an argument, in tatters around his feet, after the last 4 or 5 years of that behaviour, and when it's all fallen down around him and he's living with the consequences, he's still insisting that no, it's not a problem, that everything's fine here, and etc. And we all know, everybody knows, this is not an argument that I have to make, that there's nobody, I believe, unless you're out of touch with what's happening in Manchester, there's nobody watching this programme who says to themselves, what's he talking about? Manchester schools are praised, and they're the envy of the region, and people are clamouring to buy houses all over Manchester to get in because they want to get into our great schools. They're fighting with each other to buy houses to get into our city. It just isn't the case. Now, we're lucky we have had an economic upturn that's been going on now for some years. And so we've got very low unemployment. We're the 15th, imagine this, we're the 15th richest municipality in the United States of America. And there are those who simply don't know that. And there are those who are not able to avail of it. I understand that too. I'm not saying just because we're the 15th richest municipality in the United States, in the 5th richest state in the United States. Those of you who are watching this, who are working 2 jobs, or single-parent families struggling to put food on the table and to keep the lights on, I know. There are many schools in Manchester with more than 50% of people in them who are on free and reduced lunch. But just be very careful to note that despite that fact being true, and those who want to recognize that fact and say, well, here's a fact, I have a fact for you, and I agree with that fact, then I challenge them to recognize the fact that they live in one of the least taxed cities in the United States. They live in the 5th richest state in the United States, and they live in the 15th richest municipality in the United States, because those are facts also. And while it's true that we shouldn't be asking impoverished people or elderly people on fixed incomes who don't have COLAs and steps, etc., we shouldn't be relying on them, those people who've lived a life in the city of Manchester paying property taxes. We shouldn't be leaning on them to fund the future. It's also true, and because that is true, it is also true that it makes no sense whatsoever that we're the 15th richest municipality in the country and the 5th richest state in the country, and we can't supply to our children the needs that they have. That we have special education kids in this city who cannot get the services they want unless they lawyer up. I remember talking to somebody about a kid who was a middle school kid who was seriously physically and intellectually disabled, and they were riding in a bus going home from school every day, and the ride was an hour and a half, because the bus was shared with others, and that's just the way it was. So their ride every day was an hour and a half. So this poor girl of 13 years old was put on a minibus every day at 2:30, and she arrived at her house at 4 o'clock. And she had to sit there. And I brought to the attention of the administration the fact that because of policy, that there was no they weren't allowed to stop the bus, and there was no one to accompany this kid to go to the bathroom. So there was no bathroom accommodation for this 13-year-old girl. So this 13-year-old special needs child had to basically, excuse me for being so blunt, cross her legs as she was being transported for an hour and a half in a City of Manchester bus. That's the city you're living in, ladies and gentlemen. So You can put your blinders on, and when those people come to your doors and they're knocking on your doors over the next 7 days and they're telling you about whatever they're telling you, if they're not giving you answers to the real problems of the city of Manchester and telling you how they're going to fund our schools properly, then they are conning you. Or alternatively, they just don't know what they're talking about, because there are a number of candidates who I've seen their school board candidates. I've seen their public literature and how they talk, and I shake my head, because I look at reality and I look at what they've put in print, and I'm like, these two things don't match. It's like that person either had this leaflet printed knowing that it was all garbage, or they actually believe that garbage, and that's what they think they're going to do when they get elected. The history of public office in the city of Manchester is replete with people who have come riding in on their white horse, who are going to, find all the secret sources of waste in the school district, and they're, power handlers of numbers, and I'm a spreadsheet guy, and I know how to work spreadsheets, and oh yeah, that's what it is it? Oh, you're smart, and all the people who are there already are dumb, and it couldn't possibly be the case that you spend less on schools than everybody else, and that's the problem. No. That's not the problem. The problem is there's some secret body of money in there being wasted on something. I don't know what that is. I don't know what they think the waste might be on. Helicopter flights. I don't know what they think the school district is doing with the money. I know that our school budget last year was $167 million, all told. I know that if we were to spend the state average, which is $15,000, give or take a tenner, that our budget would be $210 million for the 14,000 students, or a little more. So those numbers tell me that we're $43 million off from where we would be if we were on the state average. Now, if we were ever to spend what they spend in the richer towns in New Hampshire, well, boy, would that blow the budget or not. And I'm not on here saying we need $210 million. I'd have a heart attack. I wouldn't want to do it myself. But there are people who are saying that the lowest funded school district in the state doesn't need any more money and actually is wasting money, and they're going to go in and find it. The very same people, by the way, who will tell you this on your doorstep don't know very little about the actual workings of the school district. Like, if you actually ask them beyond questions 1, 2, and 3, when you get to question 4, they're like, oh, I didn't know that. And you say question 5. And I don't do this in a manner that I'm trying to be argumentative, or I'm trying to be, sort of a one-upmanship thing. I mean, I get into conversations with people around the school district, and now I'm sounding like maybe that I think I'm smarter than others. I don't, but I've been looking at it for a long time, spent a lot, and I still learn new stuff every day. And I taught some of these candidates for office, and they simply. They have these, they're running based on, well, some are running because the mayor asked them to run, right? Because the mayor's done this. He's gone out and he's twisted arms and tried to convince people to go and run for him. And he's fed them a load of baloney about what the real issue is. And so when you talk to them, they haven't done much study. They really don't know that of which they're talking about. And all of a sudden, they're like, well, I didn't know that. Or they'd say, well, if that's true, I have to go back and look at that. We'll have to talk again. And then there are some people and who are running for office who I just disagree with, because we have a different way of viewing things. But I recognize them as potential contributors because, they're bringing a nuance to sort of an understanding to the school board that I hope will bring them to the point where they'll recognize where the problems are, and that they will that we'll be able to reach wiser decisions. The idea of just standing there and saying no is not going to get us anywhere. We have a new teacher's contract that's going to come up in the next year, which needs to be that will be renegotiated. And I hope, for all our sakes, that we have some people doing a renegotiation who are not confrontational and gotcha in their mindset, but rather that we can have the teachers of Manchester, and the administration and the public and everybody of one mind, doing the best that we can do for the schools. And there are places where we can make changes that would allow for greater flexibility, that would allow for teachers who want to do things slightly differently or in a different way. I think there are areas that we can look at. But if we get wrapped around the axle on topics that are just unimportant to the big scheme of things, then that won't be helpful. And we've seen that. I've talked about the union leader many times, and to again say that I'm not really against the union leader. The union leader is a far right-wing Republican conservative newspaper. Some people might argue with the far right. So whatever words, then just call it right wing if you want. But that's what it's self-declared is, and I'm fine with it because that's what it is. If I lived in a city that had a newspaper that says, "Oh, we're a liberal, progressive newspaper," then we should just kind of state that and move on from there too. So I'm not saying the union leader is wrong to do what it does, but the union leader has a particular slant, and so it's just the way it is. Doesn't mean they're lying. It just means that that's the way they view the world. And we see this as an example of when we look at the questions asked of the candidates running for office in Manchester. And when I see the questions, it just it's quite disturbing that these petty questions are the 3 questions or the 4 questions that the union leader sought to ask candidates. And none more so than the canard about health care for public servants. Frankly, who cares? I've moved my position on this topic because the city is self-insured, and so if somebody is on health care given to them through being a board member, and if they ever were seriously ill or whatever, the city picks up all that tab up to $250,000. But the numbers I've been given for, I think there were 5 people on the school board who availed themselves of the healthcare thing. So let's make a decision. If the decision is not to supply health, that there shouldn't be health care for part-time school board members, if there isn't health care for part-time employees, which I think is the strongest argument, alongside the argument that says why should public representatives who are meant to be voluntary positions, why should they be getting health care when we've got children in our school district not getting the services that they need? And so then let's just abandon it and move on. I'm kind of disappointed that the current board didn't make the decision. Then it would have affected the incoming board. But too little, too late. It didn't happen. Now we'll have to wait for another 2 years for it again. But I have to tell you, my suspicion is that those who want to talk about that issue, they want to talk about that issue because they don't want to talk about the bigger issue. Because it doesn't matter. Who cares? Give it to them. Don't give it to them. Fine. Let's move on to the real subject. The whole thing doesn't amount to a hill of beans. Is it right? If you feel strongly that they shouldn't have it, then I think you've got a legitimate point of view that, especially, when it's at its most egregious, when you have people on the school board. I can understand, for instance, that somebody who is disabled or something, or somebody who's unemployed, or somebody who this healthcare is a big deal to because they don't have to go out and get it on the private market. It would cost them a lot of money. But when there are people who are well-to-do, people owning multiple properties, or people living in very large, expensive houses, and with people who own businesses and obviously have money, when they're getting health care off of the poorest of taxpayers in the city of Manchester, and they're getting it off the back of kids on free and reduced lunch who can't get the books they need to go to school, whether the teacher in the room necessary to bring the classes down, then that's a step too far. So fine. So let's move on, because it's great. That's the low-hanging fruit. Let's just do that. And now let's talk about the real issues in the city of Manchester, about what we're doing with our schools, what we're doing with our education, and how we move forward. And yet the union leader wants to talk about that. And then the charter issues. Are we not all sick to the teeth with the charter issues and lowering up on topics? And it's just the whole thing is dysfunctional. I'm not. I talked last week about the issue around Mr. Gerard and his taping of a secret meeting, albeit as someone who was asked to clerk the meeting, etc. And I did, so I understand those who make the point about it. I think when it comes to be sauce for the goose and sauce for the gander kind of thing, given the way that Representative Tessier was treated a month earlier, that it's only right that everybody be treated the same. But my deepest wish would be that everybody would be just a little bit more understanding and move on to talk about topics that are actually important to education. I think about some of the candidates who are running now going forward again. I worry that we'll have a new board seated in January, and we'll have January and February of navel gazing and discussion and people getting their arms around things, and everything will cease until we move forward again. I'm hoping that the incoming school board will do the redistricting thing. I think they've got an excuse, especially the new people can stand out of the way and say, oh, this is something that others have been dealing with. Let's redistrict, have the redistricting done so we can move on then and talk about the bigger issue, which is about how we resource these schools. Because as I've said many times, I'm all in favour of redistricting. I want it to happen. But in the end, the day after, like if you, as I was saying, I was on a radio show earlier on today, and if you had, if you have 300 kids and 10 teachers, and it would be great if there were 30 in each of the classes, so you had 10 classes of 30, so there was an even distribution. What redistricting will do is that if there's a class with 15 and a class with 45 and every other class has got 30, the 15 and 45 will be balanced out and we'll end up with 10 classes of 30. The point is we'll still have 10 classes of 30 when we're finished. The day after we finish redistricting, ladies and gentlemen, to be very clear, those who want to go down that rabbit hole, the day after it's complete, with all the pain that it will bring, and I agree that it should happen, but there won't be one single extra teacher hired in the city of Manchester. We'll have exactly the same number of teachers the day before we redistricted as we do the day after. And all we'll have is a more even distribution of kids. So yes, it's a good thing. But it won't change the fact that we've got the least number of teachers per pupil of any town in the state of New Hampshire. And I say that so often that sometimes it kind of gets lost, I think. But let's just call it like it is. We've got the highest level of free and reduced lunch in the state of New Hampshire, or one of the highest, and the highest in some of our schools. So clearly we've got a population that is in need of services, etc. And even in the face of that, we have less adults in the school system per head than any other school district in the state. That's just unconscionable and unreasonable, and that's where a concentration should be. And if the union leader really wanted to do right by the city of Manchester, instead of asking incoming candidates these sort of politically loaded, ideologically driven, unimportant stuff about the charter and how do you feel about obeying the charter and the issue of health care for whatever, the first questions easily should have been, will you work to ensure that the city of Manchester isn't the least well-funded school system in the state? Will you work to ensure that educational outcomes in the city of Manchester are improved across all schools, across all grades, across all socioeconomic groups? Will you work to ensure that the disparities in the outcomes for children in the city of Manchester are ameliorated so that there is more even distribution? Will you work to ensure that there are a greater number of teachers in front of kids in Manchester than there currently is as the lowest in the state? Will you work to ensure that our facilities are improved for the first time in 15 years and we actually begin to stop sweating the asset that we have and to start improving the asset that we have? Those are the questions that should be asked by the of candidates for office in the city of Manchester, not these partisan petty stuff. And I listen to others occasionally talk on this time, and they'll go on and on and on, and they want to talk whatever the issue du jour is, whatever the topic that will And the commonality in the topic always is that their bottom line is they're not going to spend a dime because they're actually just cheap. That's their first thing, right? So their whole answer to everything is we're not going to spend a dime. We're going to start from there. So now let's find something to talk about that's not going to cost anything. So we won't talk about how we get more teachers because we want to talk about something because that would actually involve making a tough decision. There's a reason why Mayor Gratz drives around Manchester, metaphorically like the Queen of England sitting in the back of an open-top car waving his hand and smiling at everybody and telling everybody, isn't it lovely here? The reason is because if he actually had to tackle the hard issues, he'd have to come up with answers. And Mayor Gatz's only answer for anything is to call a couple of his buddies with big wallets somewhere, which is not to be ignored. It's nice to have buddies with big fat wallets. It's odd that when they're the same people contributing fortunes to your campaign, there's obviously, the quid pro quo is at least that, I'm told that, well, they're buddies, that's why this happens. And that's fine if you believe that. That's great. That could possibly be true. But when your only answer to real needs in the city is, I'll call up some multi-millionaire businessman who lives out of town and I'll have him write a check for $5,000 and then we'll have a big presentation at City Hall and we'll stand there with the outside check and we'll all shake hands. We'll get a little photograph of the union leader, and if it's something really big, we'll have WMUR come in and have Adam Sexton say a few words facing the camera, and won't this be lovely? That's our answer. Because what we won't do is actually challenge the state of New Hampshire to fund programs properly in the city of Manchester that ought to be state funded. What we won't do is hold our federal delegations' feet to the fire and insist on federal departments fully funding federal mandates, etc., and to meeting their obligations to cities like the city of Manchester. We won't go end up bringing Secretary Carson in here and holding his feet to the fire, the Secretary of HUD, and talking about housing issues in the city of Manchester, etc. No, because we're going to play nicely with all of those people because we have political ambitions to run for higher office. I don't think the problem's that great for anybody going out to vote on November 7th. I think if you listen to the bullying tactics of some and the lies of others, and you see this, this very simplistic stuff. When I see people, one friend of mine ran literature in the city of Manchester and running for public office, and he talks about being pro-life. Well, I happen to be Catholic, and yet I was still looking at this. I'm like, why are you introducing that topic into a municipal election? Like, why are you not just being more forthright with people? Because you have no answers to the actual, because you're in the I won't spend a dime category, and you're there because the mayor bullied you into running and made you run and wants you to run. And so you don't have any answers other than, I'm here for more of the same and I'm going to hold the line and, we're not going to have any big change here. And then you introduce these kind of topics. I just reject all of that. That's pulling at strings and trying to get you to vote against your own self-interest. I would vote for people who have answers to the questions. They've got a vision for the future of Manchester. They're excited about running for office and about being in office for the next 2 years. That will be answerable to you, the electorate. They're the people you should vote for. I would ask you to go out and vote on November 7th. If my suggestion helps you at all in one to go one way or the other, my choice for mayor is very plain. I'm pro Joyce Craig because I think she's the one with the right combination of talents and programs for the future of the city. And I'm just tired of fighting with Mayor Gratz and trying to get him to move off the dime he's been on for such a long, long time, much to the detriment of our kids in school. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're here. I'll see you next Tuesday night. All things being equal, and we'll be doing it again. That will be the night of the election. Please, please, please go out and vote for the candidate of your choice, and we'll talk again in a week from now. Thank you, and good night from Jim O'Connell.